It was January 2nd, 1967. The sky over the Red River Delta was a bruised shade of grey. A dense, suffocating layer of stratocumulus clouds blanketed North Vietnam, creating a natural ceiling at 2,000 meters. To the naked eye, the world was quiet. The rice paddies were still. The anti-aircraft batteries sat dormant in the mist. But inside the command bunkers buried deep beneath the earth, the war was already screaming. In the dim, cigarette-hazed light of the Phuoc Yen Air Base Command Center, the air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and nervous sweat. This was the nerve center of the Vietnam People's Air Force. But looking over the shoulders of the Vietnamese ground controllers were men who did not belong to this jungle landscape. They were the Soviet military advisors. They were the architects of the most sophisticated air defense network in history, a web of radar and missiles designed to bleed the American air power dry. On this particular morning, the Soviet advisors were feeling confident. They watched the sweeping green lines of the P-35 radar scopes with a practiced, almost bored intensity. For months, the rhythm of the air war had been predictable. The Americans were creatures of habit. They flew the same routes, they flew at the same times, they used the same call signs. At 1400 hours local time, the radar screens lit up. A massive formation was pushing north from Thailand. The blips were large, sluggish, and moving in a rigid, heavy formation. To the trained ears of the Soviet electronic warfare officers, the signal was unmistakable. The oscillating hum coming through the speakers was the electronic signature of the QRC-160 jamming pod. Every Soviet advisor in the room knew exactly what that sound meant. It was the electronic fingerprint of the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, the Thud. These were bomb trucks. Heavily laden, slow-moving strike aircraft carrying tons of ordnance to hit the rail yards and industrial targets near Hanoi. They were the workhorses of the American bombing campaign, and to a MiG-21 pilot, they were prey. An F-105 Thunder Chief fully loaded with bombs could not turn, it could not accelerate. It was a sitting duck, relying entirely on speed and numbers to survive. The Soviet senior advisor nodded to the Vietnamese flight controller. The trap was set. The Americans were flying blind into the worst weather of the season, following a predictable path straight into the teeth of the defense network. The order went out to the flight line. Scramble! On the tarmac at Phuoc Yen, the afterburners of the MiG-21 aircraft ignited, shooting cones of blue-orange fire into the mist. These were the prides of the Soviet aerospace industry. Small, delta-winged interceptors that were essentially rockets with cockpits. They were designed for exactly this moment. To sprint upward, punch through the cloud deck, and slash through a formation of lumbering bombers before the Americans even knew they were there. The plan was standard. The MiG-21 aircraft would use the cloud cover as a shield. They would rely on the Ground Control Intercept, the GCI, to guide them perfectly into position beneath the American formation. Then, like sharks breaching the water, they would pop up through the clouds, fire their K-13 heat-seeking missiles at the bellies of the heavy bombers, and dive back into the safety of the mist. It was a tactic that had worked dozens of times. It was simple. It was brutal. It was mathematically assured. The Soviet advisors watched the radar scopes as the two forces merged. The bright blips of the MiG-21 aircraft closed the distance with the lumbering formation of what they believed were F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The geometry was perfect. The Americans were flying a fluid 4 formation, typical for a bombing run. They were maintaining the airspeed of a heavy strike package. Everything the radar told the Soviets confirmed that this would be a slaughter. The lead Vietnamese pilot Sambi broke the cloud layer. He expected to see the dark, heavy silhouettes of Thunder Chiefs laden with iron bombs. He expected to see aircraft struggling to maintain altitude. Expected panic. Instead, he found a nightmare. As the MiG-21 aircraft broke the ceiling, the bombers did not panic. They did not jettison their bombs to gain speed. In fact, they didn't have any bombs at all. The American aircraft suddenly broke formation with a violence that should have been impossible for a heavy bomber. They banked hard, their engines roaring with a pitch that sounded different, sharper, more aggressive. The silhouettes were wrong. These weren't the single-tailed, heavy-bodied Thunder Chiefs. These aircraft had the distinct predatory hunch of the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, and they were waiting. Total confusion erupted in the command bunker. The radio channels, usually disciplined and terse, dissolved into a cacophony of screams and urgent warnings. Enemy fighters! Enemy fighters! Break left! Break left! The Soviet advisors stared at the radar screens in disbelief. The physics of the battle had inverted in a single second. The blips that were supposed to be the prey had suddenly turned on the predators. The geometric perfection of the intercept collapsed into a chaotic furball. The MiG-21 aircraft, designed for a high-speed slash-and-dash attack, was suddenly trapped in a turning fight, a dogfight against the one American plane that could match their power. The F-4 Phantom jets were not fleeing. They were engaging. Up in the grey skies, the slaughter began. But it was the wrong side that was bleeding. One MiG-21 aircraft exploded in a fireball, its pieces raining down through the clouds. Then another. The Vietnamese pilots, disoriented and terrified, tried to dive back into the clouds, but the bombers followed them down. The Americans were firing Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles, with a precision that suggested they had known exactly where the MiGs would appear. It was as if the Americans had read the script. In the bunker, the atmosphere shifted from confidence to cold, paralyzing dread. A Soviet radar technician frantically checked his equipment. Had the radar malfunctioned? Had the Americans developed a device that could mask the physical shape of their aircraft on the scope? The electronic signature had been perfect. The jamming pods were the ones used by the F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The speed was the speed of the F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The formation was the formation of the F-105 Thunder Chiefs. Reality and data were at war. The radar said, "Bomber." The pilots screaming on the radio said, "Fighter." Within 12 minutes, the sky fell silent. The surviving MiG-21 aircraft, low on fuel and terrified, fled toward the Chinese border or made desperate landings on auxiliary strips. The radar scopes cleared. The American formation, having carved a hole in the heart of the North Vietnamese Air Force, turned around and headed back to Thailand. 7 MiG-21 aircraft were gone. 7 pillars of the Soviet air defense strategy had been swatting out of the sky in less time than it took to smoke a cigarette. The loss was catastrophic. This was almost half of the operational MiG-21 force in North Vietnam. But the numbers were not the primary source of the fear that now gripped the men in the bunker. Equipment could be replaced. Pilots eventually could be trained. The true horror was the mystery. The Soviet advisors gathered around the telemetry data, their faces pale. They replayed the tapes. They listened to the audio recordings of the jamming signals. They analyzed the radar cross-sections. It made no sense. If the Americans could make an F-4 Phantom look and sound exactly like an F-105 bomber on radar, then the entire premise of the Soviet air defense network was obsolete. The GCI ground control intercept relied entirely on knowing what the target was. You don't send a light interceptor to fight a heavy fighter if you can help it. You pick your battles. You attack the weak. But if the Americans could wear a digital mask, if they could disguise their wolves as sheep, then there were no safe battles. Every blip on the screen became a potential death trap. Before we dive deeper into the investigation that consumed the KGB and the Soviet military hierarchy, I want to welcome you to the channel. If you are fascinated by the hidden chess matches of the 20th century and the technology that defined them, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We decode the history you were never taught. The immediate aftermath of the battle, which the Americans would later call Operation Bolo, was a frantic lockdown of the North Vietnamese airspace. The MiG-21 fleet was grounded, not because they were damaged, but because the command structure was paralyzed by doubt. In Moscow, the reports arrived on the desks of the highest-ranking generals of the PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The tone of the cables was not angry. It was bewildered. The advisors on the ground were reporting a technological anomaly. They claimed the Americans had achieved a level of electronic alchemy that defied the known laws of radar reflection. Some theorized that the Americans had deployed a new airframe entirely, a hybrid aircraft that could change its flight characteristics mid-air. Others believed the CIA had compromised the Soviet radar codes, feeding false data directly into the scopes from the ground. The paranoia was palpable. If the radar could lie, then the sky was no longer theirs. The stakes were existential. The Soviet Union was currently exporting the MiG-21 and its associated radar systems to allies around the world, to Egypt, to Syria, to India. It was marketed as the ultimate interceptor, a shield against Western aggression. If the Americans had found a skeleton key to unlock the defenses of the MiG-21, the balance of power in the Cold War had just tilted violently in Washington's favor. The advisors in Vietnam were given a directive from the Kremlin: find out what happened. find out how they did it, and fix it before the Americans wipe the sky clean. But as the sun set on that grey January day, the wreckage of 7 MiG-21 aircraft smouldering in the jungle was the only evidence they had. The ghosts had vanished back to their bases in Thailand, taking their secret with them. The hunt for the answer would lead the Soviets down a rabbit hole of technical paranoia, forcing them to question the very senses they used to see the world. They were looking for a technological breakthrough, a complex new machine, or a revolutionary computer virus. They had no idea that the weapon that had defeated them wasn't a computer chip or a new radar. It wasn't a machine at all. The mystery of January 2nd was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of imagination. And the investigation was about to begin. The silence that fell over the North Vietnamese airfields in the days following January 2nd was heavier than the monsoon rains. The MiG-21 aircraft, usually kept on 5-minute alert status, sat dormant in their revetments, covered in canvas tarps. They looked like shrouded corpses. For the first time in the war, the skies over North Vietnam belonged entirely to the Americans. The VPAF, the Vietnam People's Air Force, stood down. They had to. You cannot fight an enemy, you cannot identify. Inside the briefing rooms, the atmosphere was toxic with suspicion and fatigue. A special investigative commission was formed almost immediately, comprised of the highest-ranking officers of the VPAF and a team of grim-faced technical specialists flown in from Moscow. Their mandate was simple: explain the impossible. The investigation began in a windowless room at the Bac Mai airfield, where the walls were plastered with oversized acetate overlays of the radar tracks from the battle. The Soviet technicians, men who had spent their lives designing the logic gates and magnetrons of the fan song and spoon rest radars, stared at the squiggly grease pencil lines as if they were trying to read a dead language. They started with the hard data, the electronic intelligence collected during the 12-minute slaughter. The senior Soviet electronic warfare specialist, a man named Colonel Volkov, played the magnetic tapes of the intercepted radio frequencies. The room filled with the rhythmic, oscillating warble of the American jamming signal. "Listen," Volkov said, pointing a lit cigarette at the spinning reel. "That is the QRC-160 jamming pod. It operates in the S-band. It has a specific pulse repetition frequency. We have catalogued this signal for 2 years. It belongs to the F-105 Thunderchief. It is a heavy, power-hungry system." He stopped the tape and looked at the assembled pilots and officers. "The F-4 Phantom," he continued, his voice tight, "does not carry this system. It cannot. The Phantom uses a different generator configuration. It lacks the hard points wired for this specific pod. Furthermore, the radar return, the cross-section we saw on the scopes, was consistent with a heavy bomber formation flying straight and level." One of the surviving Vietnamese pilots, a young lieutenant who had barely ejected in time, slammed his hand on the table. "The radar is wrong," he shouted, breaking the rigid protocol of the meeting. "I saw them! They were phantoms! They were already in a turn when we broke the clouds! They were waiting for us!" The room went quiet. The conflict between the machine and the man was absolute. The Soviets were materialists. They believed in physics, in vacuum tubes, in the immutable laws of radar reflection. For the radar to show a bomber and the eye to see a fighter, something fundamental had to have broken in the nature of reality. 3 distinct theories began to emerge, each more disturbing than the last. The first theory was the ghost injection. The KGB advisors suggested that the Americans had not just jammed the radar but had actively hacked it. They speculated that the CIA had deployed a new terrifying weapon, an aircraft or a drone flying at high altitude that could project ghost targets onto the Soviet radar screens. In this scenario, the bombers the Soviets tracked never existed. They were electronic hallucinations projected to lure the MiGs into a specific kill box where the Phantoms were waiting silently, radars off, invisible to the ground controllers. If this were true, it meant the entire Soviet air defense network, the most expensive and extensive in the world, was comprised. It meant the Americans could paint whatever picture they wanted on the Soviet screens. They could make a single fighter look like a fleet of bombers, or a nuclear strike look like a flock of birds. The second theory was the Super Phantom. The engineering teams argued that perhaps the Americans had rolled out a completely new variant of the F-4 Phantom. They sketched diagrams of a Phantom with an enlarged fuselage, massive internal generators, and integrated electronic warfare suites that mimicked the signature of the F-105 Thunderchief. "But why?" a Vietnamese general asked. "Why spend millions to make a fast plane look slow?" "To kill us," Volkov replied grimly. This theory gained traction. It fit the Soviet view of American military-industrial power. The Americans had infinite money. They could build anything. The idea of a Q ship, a wolf in sheep's clothing, was an old naval tactic, but applying it to supersonic warfare was a leap that terrified the strategists. If the Americans were building aircraft solely for deception, what else were they hiding? The third theory was the most paranoid of all. It whispered through the barracks and the mess halls. The pilots began to suspect that their own codes had been sold. Had a traitor provided the Americans with the exact frequencies and blind spots of the search radars? The paranoia turned inward. Technicians were interrogated. Flight logs were scrutinized. The trust between the Soviet advisors and their Vietnamese counterparts, always fragile, began to fracture. While the committees argued, the psychological toll on the VPAF pilots was devastating. The legend of the battle grew with every retelling. The American aircraft weren't just phantoms, they were ghosts. They could vanish. They could change shape. Reports started coming in from other sectors of impossible sightings. A radar operator near Haiphong claimed to see a formation of B-52 Stratofortress bombers moving at Mach 2. Another claimed to track a helicopter at 60,000 feet. The discipline of the observation corps was breaking down. Every glitch, every atmospheric anomaly, every bird flock was now a potential American superweapon. The paralysis lasted for days. The North Vietnamese government demanded answers from Moscow. Send us better radar, they pleaded. Send us the new MiG-23 aircraft. Send us something that can see through the lies. But Moscow had nothing to send because they didn't know what the problem was. They were trying to solve a hardware problem, but they were looking at the wrong hardware. They spent weeks analyzing the wreckage of the downed MiG-21 aircraft, looking for evidence of a new American missile warhead or a strange radiation signature. They found nothing but twisted aluminum and burnt circuitry. The investigation reached a fever pitch when a piece of debris from an American aircraft, not from the January 2nd battle, but a subsequent skirmish, was brought to the analysis center. It was a fragment of a wing pylon. The Soviet engineers swarmed over it. They measured the wiring bundles. They analyzed the bolt patterns. They realized that the wiring on this F-4 Phantom pylon was non-standard. It had been modified in the field. It looked hasty, almost crude. This is not a factory modification, a frantic engineer noted in his report. This was done by mechanics, with hand tools. This discovery only deepened the confusion. How could a field modification create an electronic ghost? They were looking for a supercomputer, but they found spliced wires. The Soviet intelligence apparatus began to scour the American press, looking for clues. They read Aviation Week and Space Technology, which they jokingly called Aviation Leak, hoping for a slip-up. They looked for budget approvals for a stealth jammer or a new electronic warfare aircraft. They found nothing. The Americans were silent. The trap had been sprung, the MiGs had been smashed, and the trapdoor had been closed. By late January, the investigation had stalled. The official conclusion was a face-saving mixture of jargon and vague warnings. The report stated, "The enemy has employed a new tactical application of high-density electronic jamming combined with deceptive flight profiles. Caution is advised. Visual identification is mandatory before engagement." It was a non-answer. Visual identification is mandatory was a death sentence in modern air combat. If you had to wait until you could see the rivets on the enemy plane to know if it was a bomber or a fighter, you were already dead. The Sparrow missile could kill you from 10 miles away. The Soviets had failed to solve the mystery. They assumed the Americans had achieved a quantum leap in technology. They assumed the F-4 Phantom had been fundamentally redesigned. They assumed the radar network was obsolete. They were wrong on all counts. While the Soviets were hunting for a technological ghost, looking for complex circuitry and new airframes, the answer was sitting in a metal box on a workbench in an American airbase in Thailand. It wasn't a new invention. It wasn't a computer hack. It was a trick so simple, so analog, and so incredibly risky that a Soviet committee, paralyzed by doctrine and procedure, could never have imagined it. The Soviets were playing chess. The Americans, it turned out, were playing poker, and the man holding the cards was about to reveal his hand. While the Soviet advisors in the damp bunkers of Hanoi were chasing ghosts and constructing elaborate conspiracy theories about CIA holograms and hacked radar codes, the answer to their mystery was sitting on a humid tarmac in Thailand, 300 miles away. It was not a supercomputer, it was not a new stealth airframe. It was a metal cylinder about the size of a man, painted olive drab, suspended from the wing pylon of an aircraft where it technically wasn't supposed to be. To understand the genius of the trap, we have to leave the sterile, paranoid analysis rooms of the Soviet intelligence apparatus and step into the sweltering, kerosene-soaked chaos of Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. This was the home of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, known as the Wolfpack, and in late 1966, the Wolfpack was led by a man who was the living antithesis of the Soviet committee system. Colonel Robin Olds was 44 years old. He was a triple ace from World War II, a man who had shot down Nazis over Europe before most of his pilots were out of grade school. He wore a non-regulation handlebar mustache that flagrantly violated Air Force grooming standards. He drank hard, flew harder, and possessed a tactical mind that functioned less like a textbook and more like a street fighter. Olds had a problem. A deadly problem. The North Vietnamese MiG-21 aircraft, under the strict guidance of their Soviet controllers, were refusing to play the game. They knew the F-4 Phantom jets were superior fighters, faster, better armed and flown by better pilots. So, the Soviets had instructed the Vietnamese to avoid the Phantoms entirely. The strategy was frustratingly effective. The MiG-21 aircraft would stay grounded when the F-4 Phantom patrols swept through. They would wait. Then, the moment the slow, heavy F-105 Thunder Chief bombers arrived to strike their targets, the MiGs would launch, slash through the formation, destroy the bombers, and vanish before the Phantoms could intervene. It was a guerrilla war in the sky. The Americans were the heavy infantry, marching in circles, while the Soviets guided the snipers to pick off the weak. Olds knew he couldn't win by chasing the MiGs. He had to make them come to him. He had to present them with a target so tempting, so vulnerable, that they would break their own rules of engagement. He needed a disguise. The key to the disguise lay in the very technology the Soviets were tracking: the electronic jamming pod. The F-105 Thunder Chiefs carried the QRC-160 jamming pod. It was a piece of electronic warfare gear designed to clutter the Soviet fan-song fire control radars used by the SA-2 surface-to-air missile batteries. When a formation of F-105 bombers flew with these pods active, they created a distinct, muddy strobe on the Soviet radar screens. It screamed, "Heavy bomber formation." The F-4 Phantom jets, however, did not carry these pods. They didn't have the wiring for them, they didn't have the mounting racks. And tactically, they relied on speed and maneuverability, not jamming, to survive. This distinction was the cornerstone of the Soviet identification process. If the radar screen showed the jamming strobe, it was a target, a bomber. If it showed a clean return, it was a threat, a fighter. In mid-December 1966, during a raucous, alcohol-fueled brainstorming session, a tactics conference that looked more like a frat party, Olds and his tactical officers hit upon the idea that would shatter the Soviet air defense network. The question was simple: what if we act like the other guys? The plan, codenamed Operation Bolo, was a masterclass in behavioral engineering. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about the psychology of the enemy. Olds realized that the Soviet advisors were creatures of habit and rigid doctrine. They trusted their instruments more than their intuition. If the instrument said bomber, the Soviets would believe bomber. The logistical hurdle was immense. The QRC-160 pods were in short supply. They were allocated strictly to the F-105 bomber wings. Olds had to use his rank, his reputation, and a fair amount of creative acquisition to secure enough pods for his Phantom fleet. But getting the pods was only step one. The F-4 Phantom was not built to carry them. This is where American ingenuity, the garage mechanic spirit, clashed directly with the Soviet top-down philosophy. In the days leading up to the operation, the ground crews at Ubon worked around the clock in the blistering heat. They didn't have official manuals for this modification. They were splicing wires, fabricating mounts, and essentially hacking the aircraft's electrical systems to accept the foreign device. On the Soviet side, a modification of this magnitude would have required months of committee review, authorization from Moscow, and a team of factory specialists. In Ubon, it was done by 20-year-old sergeants with wire strippers and electrical tape, fueled by coffee and the fear of losing more pilots. But the hardware was only half the disguise. To sell the lie, the F-4 Phantom pilots had to unlearn everything they knew about flying fighters. A flight of Phantoms normally flew in a loose, aggressive, fighting wing formation, 2 pairs of aircraft, spread out to cover the sky, ready to turn and burn at a moment's notice. Bombers, however, flew in a Fluid 4 pod, a tight, welded-together box of 4 aircraft. It was rigid. It was defensive. It was the formation of a herd animal, not a predator. Olds briefed his men with a severity that silenced the room. For the deception to work, they had to fly exactly like the F-105 Thunder Chiefs. They had to fly at the same altitude. They had to fly at the same airspeed, 480 knots, which was painfully slow for a Phantom. They had to use the F-105 call signs. They even had to use the F-105 refueling tracks and radio procedures. They had to wear the skin of the sheep, and they had to resist the urge to shed it until the wolf was already in the air. On the morning of January 2nd, the trap was sprung. The wolf pack took off into the grey overcast. As they climbed, they activated the QRC-160 pods. The electronic transformation was instant. To the outside world, to the physics of the electromagnetic spectrum, the sleek, deadly F-4 Phantom jets ceased to exist. In their place, the Soviet radar receivers saw the large, blooming, noisy signature of the F-105 Thunder Chief. Olds led the first flight. His call sign was Old 01, mimicking the bomber command structure. He flew straight and level, suppressing every instinct to jink or accelerate. He was flying a multi-million-dollar supersonic fighter, arguably the most powerful in the world, and he was driving it like a dump truck. As they crossed into North Vietnam, the Soviet radar network lit up. The American plan relied on the Soviets doing exactly what they were trained to do: analyze the data, categorize the target, and execute the standard intercept solution. And the Soviets performed perfectly. The advisors in the bunkers saw the jamming strobes. They checked the speed, 480 knots. They checked the altitude, 12,000 feet. They checked the formation density. Bombers, the senior controller would have said. Load bearing, vulnerable, scramble. The Americans were counting on the Soviet arrogance. The Soviet doctrine assumed that the Americans were technically proficient, but tactically predictable. They assumed the Americans would never risk their air superiority fighters in a low-speed deception. It was too risky. It was unprofessional. But they didn't account for the American capacity for calculated recklessness. High above the clouds, Olds watched his radar warning receiver. He saw the strobes of the MiG-21 radars coming online. He saw the ground controllers vectoring the enemy in. He waited. He had to wait until the MiGs were committed, until they had burned their fuel to climb, until they had popped through the cloud deck expecting a slaughter. This was the source of the mystery that baffled Moscow. It wasn't a new invention. It was a change in behavior. The Americans had weaponized the Soviet Union's own reliance on technology. They used the enemy's radar against them, turning the all-seeing eye of the Soviet defense network into the mechanism of their own destruction. The Soviets were looking for a ghost in the machine. They didn't realize that the machine was working perfectly. It was simply telling them a lie that they were desperate to believe. As the first MiG-21 broke the cloud layer, expecting to find a heavy F-105 laden with bombs, the pilot found himself looking down the intake ramps of Robin Old's Phantom. The disguise was dropped. The bombers lit their afterburners. The speed jumped from 480 knots to supersonic in seconds. The sheep bared their teeth. The technological leap here wasn't the pod itself. It was the integration of electronic warfare into tactical doctrine. It was the realization that in the electronic age, being invisible wasn't as powerful as being misidentified. While the Soviets were drafting reports about ghost signals, the Americans were celebrating the triumph of the hack. They had taken an off-the-shelf component, duct-taped it to a hot rod, and used it to blind the most sophisticated air defense empire on Earth. But the true shock for the Soviets was yet to come. Because once the debris was cleared and the initial confusion settled, they would have to confront the reality of what had happened. And that realization that they had been outsmarted, not outgunned, would trigger a panic that would reach all the way to the Kremlin. The truth did not arrive in Hanoi with a thunderclap. It arrived in a manila envelope carried by a courier from the Soviet embassy, containing grainy black and white reconnaissance photographs and a technical analysis report from a crash site deep in the jungle. For weeks, the Soviet advisors had been operating under the assumption that they were facing a new, terrifying breed of aircraft. They had imagined a super Phantom with integrated electronic warfare suites, or a secret CIA drone program. They had projected their own fears of technological inferiority onto the blank canvas of the American military-industrial complex. But as Colonel Volkov and the VPAF High Command opened the dossier on a humid February morning, the shock was not the presence of advanced technology. It was the absence of it. The report detailed the wreckage of a Phantom that had been lost in a subsequent engagement. The focus was on the wing pylons. There were no new microprocessors. There were no revolutionary exotic materials. There was simply a standard NATO-issue bomb rack, hastily rewired to accept a generic external store. And then, the intelligence confirmation, the secret weapon that had blinded the P-35 radars and lured 7 MiG-21 aircraft to their deaths was the QRC-160 jamming pod. The room went silent. The advisors stared at the photos. They knew this pod. They had manuals on it. It was 1,950 seconds technology. It was a noisemaker, a brute force barrage jammer used by the heavy F-105 Thunderchief bombers. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The Americans hadn't invented a new plane. They hadn't hacked the code. They had simply taken a pod from a truck, bolted it onto a Ferrari, and driven the Ferrari like a truck until the moment the trap snapped shut. The Super Phantom was a myth. The Ghost was a lie. The humiliation was absolute. The Soviet military machine prided itself on scientific rigor. Their doctrine was built on the certainty of mathematics. Radar returns were treated as facts. If the scope showed a bomber formation, it was a bomber formation. The idea that the enemy would deliberately cripple the performance of their best fighter jets, forcing them to fly slow, straight, and heavy just to play a psychological game, was something the rigid Soviet curriculum had never covered. They had been defeated by a prank, a deadly calculated, high-stakes prank. The shock rippled upward from Hanoi to Moscow. The report that landed on the desk of Marshal Pavel Batitsky, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, was devastating. It wasn't just about the 7 lost MiG-21 aircraft. It was about the integrity of the entire Soviet worldview. If the Americans could make a Phantom look like a Thunderchief with a simple pod, what else were they faking? Was that flight of B-52 Stratofortress bombers on the radar actually a swarm of drones? Was that single reconnaissance plane actually a nuclear strike wing flying in tight formation? The fog of war, which radar was supposed to eliminate, had just become thicker than ever. The electronic eyes of the Soviet Union could no longer be trusted. The reaction from the Kremlin was swift, furious, and ultimately futile. First, the stand-down order. The North Vietnamese Air Force, the Red Aces, who had been the terror of the American skies, were grounded. The MiG-21 fleet was pulled back. The pilots were ordered back to the classroom. The Soviet advisors were forced to rewrite the entire book on ground control interception, GCI. The new doctrine was paralyzed by caution. Visual confirmation mandatory. This order, while logical, was a strategic catastrophe. The MiG-21 was not a dogfighter. It was an interceptor. It was designed to be a bullet. Launched by radar, guided by radar, firing a missile at a blip on a screen, and running away. It had poor visibility from the cockpit. It had a short range. By forcing the pilots to visually identify the target before engaging, the Soviets were stripping the MiG-21 of its only advantage: surprise. They were forcing a sniper to fight with a knife. The second part of the response was the industrial panic. The Soviet military-industrial complex, stung by the ease with which their fan song and fire can radars had been fooled, lurched into a desperate development cycle. They needed a radar that couldn't be lied to. This desperation fueled the acceleration of the MiG-25 Foxbat program. The MiG-25 was a monster of an aircraft, built around massive stainless steel engines, and a radar set the RP-25 Smerch that was so powerful it used vacuum tubes because transistors couldn't handle the voltage. The logic was typically Soviet. If the Americans are using noise to hide, we will build a radar that screams louder than the noise. We will burn through their jamming with raw power. But this was a futile response to the problem revealed by Operation Bolo. The MiG-25 was fast, yes. It could fly at Mach 3, but it was a dinosaur. It was heavy, unmaneuverable, and blind to the kind of subtle, tactical deception Robin Olds had employed. The Soviets were building a bigger hammer, while the Americans were learning to pick the lock. The tragedy for the Soviet advisors in Vietnam was that they knew the fix wasn't working. Even after they understood the trick, they couldn't stop it. The Americans adapted again. Once they knew the Soviets were hesitant, they started flying mixed formations. A flight of real F-105 bombers would fly with a flight of F-4 Phantoms disguised as bombers. The Soviet radar operators would see two identical bomber formations on the screen. One was a target, the other was a trap. Which was which? They had to guess. And in the high-stakes casino of air combat, the house the Americans was rigging the deck. The Soviet controllers began to second-guess every command. Target at Angels 12, speed 480, maybe. The hesitation measured in seconds was the difference between a successful intercept and a MiG-21 aircraft exploding in a ball of flame. The shock of Operation Bolo wasn't just the loss of airframes, it was the destruction of confidence. The Soviet pilots began to doubt their controllers, the controllers began to doubt their screens, the advisors began to doubt their superiors. The seamless integration of man and machine, the socialist perfection of the GCI network, had been shattered by a colonel with a mustache and a few jamming pods. By late 1967, the air war had changed. The Americans had established a dominance that wasn't just about numbers, it was about psychological control. They had proven that they could dictate the terms of the engagement. The Soviets tried to counterattack. They introduced the MiG-21 PFM with better radar. They brought in new frequencies for the SA-2 missiles, but they were always reacting. They were always one step behind, trying to patch a hole in a dam that had already burst. The investigation into the impossible battle of January 2nd had yielded the truth, but the truth offered no comfort. It only confirmed their worst fear. The enemy was not just technologically advanced, they were creatively superior. The Americans were fighting with imagination. The Soviets were fighting with a manual. And as the war dragged on, that difference would cost the lives of hundreds of North Vietnamese pilots who flew into the blue, guided by voices in their headsets that no longer knew what was real and what was a ghost. 7-0. In the cold arithmetic of war, those numbers are rarely seen. In aerial combat, where the margin between life and death is measured in fractions of a second and inches of aluminum, a clean sweep is a statistical anomaly. It is not supposed to happen. But on January 2nd, 1967, over the jungles of North Vietnam, it did. The United States Air Force had flown into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace in the history of warfare, triggered a trap set by the best minds in the Soviet military, and walked away without a scratch. The immediate tactical impact was silence. For 10 weeks following Operation Bolo, the North Vietnamese MiG-21 fleet was effectively removed from the war. The pilots were grounded. The mechanics stripped the jets. The Soviet advisors sat in their bunkers, staring at blank radar screens, terrified to send their men up against a sky they no longer understood. But the legacy of Operation Bolo extends far beyond the kill count or the temporary grounding of an air force. It was a moment that exposed a fundamental, structural crack in the Soviet war machine, a crack that would eventually shatter the entire Soviet Union. The Soviet philosophy of war, much like its philosophy of government, was built on centralization. It was top-down. The radar operator told the GCI controller what he saw. The GCI controller told the pilot where to fly. The pilot was, in many ways, just another servo in the guidance loop of a missile. The system relied on the belief that if you had enough data and enough control, you could mathematically guarantee victory. Robin Olds and the Wolfpack proved that this philosophy was fatally flawed. They proved that in the chaos of the real world, rigid systems shatter. The Soviets had built a Maginot Line in the sky, a static, predictable defense network relying on technology to do the thinking. The Americans defeated it not with better technology, but with better thinking. They defeated it with flexibility, with deception, and with the kind of individual initiative that the Soviet system was designed to suppress. This battle forced a quiet but profound crisis within the Soviet military-industrial complex. It drove them into a panic of over-engineering. Terrified by the perceived technological gap that Bolo seemed to represent, the Soviets poured billions of rubles into projects like the MiG-25 Foxbat and the MiG-31 Foxhound, massive, brute-force machines designed to counter threats that, in some cases, didn't even exist. They were chasing ghosts. They were bankrupting their economy to build shields against American swords that were constantly changing shape. On the American side, the legacy of Bolo was the rebirth of the fighter pilot. Before this battle, the Pentagon had fallen into a similar technological trap, believing that missiles had made dogfighting obsolete. They thought the future was push-button warfare. Operation Bolo reminded the world that the most dangerous component in a fighter jet is not the radar, the engine, or the missile. It is the pilot. It is the human mind's capacity for creativity and guile. This realization led directly to the formation of the Red Flag training exercises and the Navy's Top Gun School. The US military institutionalized the lessons of Robin Olds. Technology is a tool, but the warrior is the weapon. In the decades that followed, the Phantom would eventually retire, replaced by the Eagle, the Falcon, and the Raptor. The MiG-21 would continue to fly, serving in air forces from Cuba to North Korea, a rugged testament to Soviet engineering. But the psychological wound inflicted in 1967 never truly healed. The Soviets never again fully trusted their own eyes. Every time a radar blip appeared on a screen in East Germany, or the Kola Peninsula, or the Kamchatka coast, there was a lingering doubt. Is it a bomber? Is it a fighter? Or is it a lie? The Cold War was often fought in the shadows, a silent struggle of spies and submarines. But on one grey afternoon in Southeast Asia, the conflict exploded into the light. It was a clash between two worldviews: the rigid, scientific determinism of the East and the chaotic, adaptive ingenuity of the West. The Soviets looked at the war as a game of chess, where every piece has a defined move. The Americans looked at it as a game of poker, where the strongest hand is often the one you are bluffing with. And when the cards were finally turned over above the Red River, the Soviets realized they had bet their empire on a pair of twos, while the Americans were holding a royal flush disguised as a pair of jokers. The wreckage of the 7 MiG-21 aircraft has long since been consumed by the jungle or melted down for scrap. The men who flew them are largely gone, but the lesson remains etched in the history of aerial warfare. It is a reminder that in the face of overwhelming odds, when the enemy holds the high ground and the heavy weapons, the most powerful force on the battlefield is the element of surprise. The Phantom lived up to its name. It appeared where it shouldn't be, it looked like something it wasn't, and by the time the enemy realized the truth, it was already too late.